A scene in the streets of Washington at midnight that no one could believe. American police say they found Russia's leader, Boris Yeltsin, half-naked just steps away from the White House. But did this really happen, or was it history's greatest diplomatic fabrication? Was there a conspiracy behind it? Or was Yeltsin simply a human being, a president pushing his limits? In this content, we examine every detail from hidden documents to witness statements. When you find the truth, your view of Yeltsin will change forever. But first, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because what I'm going to tell you today is not just a scandal story. This is a journey that tells how the post-Cold War world was shaped, how tensions between two superpowers became personalized, and how a leader pushing his limits was etched into world history. Washington, September 1994. The city was sleeping, but security forces were on alert. The Cold War had ended, but relations with Russia were still ice cold. Everything was under control, or at least it appeared to be, until panic moments were experienced near Blair House that night. Blair House was an official guest house where the United States hosted state guests, and Boris Yeltsin was staying there that night. The first president of the Russian Federation, one of the architects of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the leader of the country with the world's most powerful nuclear weapons arsenal. But he wasn't at Blair House that night. He was wandering the streets of Pennsylvania Boulevard in his underwear, looking for pizza. Yes, you heard right. Russian Federation President Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin was trying to find pizza in the center of Washington, escaping from security details, wearing only underwear and a t-shirt. But this story isn't just a simple drunkenness anecdote. This tells how fragile diplomatic relations are, how security protocols are violated, and how one of history's greatest secrets was hidden. But first, I want to ask you this question. Why did Yeltsin love pizza so much? Specify in the comments. Because this incident was immediately shut down. It didn't leak to the media. It was hidden from the public. No one knew for years. Until one of the Secret Service agents mentioned this night in an interview years after his retirement. That agent revealed this incident in interviews with a historian named Taylor Branch, where he recounted the Bill Clinton era. And the world was shocked. But was it really that simple? Or is there a much darker truth underlying this story? Now I want to ask you a question. If a country's top leader wanders the streets half-naked in a foreign land, escaping from security forces at midnight, does this remain just a personal scandal, or does it become a national security crisis? Because Yeltsin wasn't just a drunk man that night. He was the man who had control of 1,300 nuclear weapons, and he was lost in America's capital. So what really happened that night? How confused was Yeltsin's mind? Could he control himself, or was another force controlling him? And why did American intelligence shut this down so quickly? We'll look at all of these one by one. But first you need to understand who Yeltsin was, what kind of leader he was, and that this night was actually not so extraordinary in his life. Boris Yeltsin was born in the Sverdlovsk region in 1931. He had a difficult childhood. He grew up under the oppression of the Soviet regime. His father was a construction worker, and Yeltsin also studied engineering. But his real talent was politics. He rose quickly. He gained power within the Communist Party. However, he was someone who dared to step outside the system. He supported Gorbachev's reforms, but didn't find them radical enough. He wanted more. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Yeltsin became Russia's new leader. But was he a hero or an autocrat? The answer to this question is still controversial. Because during the 9 years Yeltsin was in power, he tried to modernize Russia, but at the same time dragged the country into economic crises, oligarchic rises, and political chaos. And throughout this process, he never gave up one habit: alcohol. Yeltsin's drinking problem was known by everyone. The Russian people knew it, world leaders knew it, intelligence services knew it. But no one fully understood how serious it was, until what happened in Washington that night came to light. In September 1994, Yeltsin came to America for diplomatic meetings with Bill Clinton. The relationship between the two leaders was complex. Although Clinton appeared to support Yeltsin, there were serious disagreements on issues such as NATO expansion and the Balkan crises. Yeltsin wanted Russia to once again be a powerful actor on the world stage. but he was becoming physically and mentally weaker. He had undergone heart surgeries, his health was deteriorating, and the effects of his alcoholism were becoming more apparent every day. That night, Yeltsin, staying at Blair House, withdrew to his room after dinner. Security forces were standing guard outside. Everything seemed normal, but something happened around midnight. Yeltsin left his room. He managed to leave quietly without seeing the security guards, and he headed to Pennsylvania Boulevard, with only his underwear and a t-shirt. His mind was completely confused. He didn't know where he was going. He was saying he wanted pizza. He was trying to hail a taxi. Secret Service agents panicked. The president of the Russian Federation was missing, in the middle of Washington, unprotected, half-naked. If the media heard about this, it would cause an international scandal. If Russian security forces learned of this, a diplomatic crisis could occur. And worst of all, if something happened to Yeltsin, relations between the two countries could be irreparably damaged. American agents immediately took action. They found Yeltsin. They tried to calm him down, but Yeltsin resisted. He wanted pizza. Apparently, he loved pizza very much. He couldn't understand why he couldn't go outside. He felt confined. Finally, the agents convinced him and took him back to Blair House. However, the incident didn't end there, because this wasn't Yeltsin's first unusual behavior in Washington. In fact, something similar happened even the next night. Again at midnight, Yeltsin left his room again. This time he was a bit more dressed, but again drunk. Yeltsin both loved pizza very much and got drunk every time because he also loved drinking. He went down to the basement of Blair House. When a security guard found him there, Yeltsin was mumbling something. The agent asked him what he was looking for. Yeltsin answered, "Just looking for a drink." The agent took him back to his room, and this incident was also shut down. So were these really just the meaningless actions of a drunk man, or were they indicators of something deeper? Because some historians and analysts interpreted these events differently. Some thought Yeltsin was experiencing a psychological crisis, being crushed under the pressure of leadership and losing control. Others put forward a darker theory. Could Yeltsin's behaviors be an excuse for Russian intelligence to test him or for American intelligence to monitor him? At this point, I need to tell you something. When such events are recorded in history, they are usually simplified, reduced, even made ridiculous. But the reality is much more complex. Because what Yeltsin did that night reveals not only his personal weaknesses, but also the geopolitical tensions of that period, the vulnerabilities of security systems, and how controlled the media was. And now comes the real big question. Why were these events hidden for years? Why didn't the media learn about this immediately? Why did the American government shut this down so quickly and quietly? The answer is simple. Because preserving diplomatic relations was much more important than the scandal coming out. The Bill Clinton administration had to keep its relations with Yeltsin strong, because Russia was still the world's largest nuclear power. Yeltsin's support was needed on NATO expansion. Cooperation on economic reforms was essential. And if this scandal broke, Yeltsin would look weak, the opposition within Russia would strengthen, and America's influence over Russia would decrease. That's why the incident was hidden. But its being hidden didn't mean it wasn't real. Secret Service agents experienced it. Bill Clinton's team knew about it. And years later, when this information leaked, the world faced one of the strangest diplomatic incidents in history. However, there's another important detail here. Yeltsin's behaviors weren't limited to Washington. Similar incidents had occurred elsewhere. For example, during a visit to Ireland, Yeltsin didn't get off the plane. He stayed on the plane for hours. The Irish Prime Minister waited at Shannon Airport, but Yeltsin never came out. The official statement was that he was unwell, but in reality, he was drunk too. In another incident, Yeltsin tried to conduct an orchestra in Germany. In front of the public, drunk, he acted like a conductor. The images were reflected in world media. Russia was embarrassed, but Yeltsin didn't seem to care. And perhaps the most famous one, during his visit to the White House in 1994, Yeltsin spoke at a press conference when it was clearly obvious he was drunk. He was mixing up words. His balance was off, but he continued to speak anyway. American officials were very uncomfortable. But what could they do? He was Russia's president. What do all these incidents tell us? That Yeltsin was really an alcoholic, or that these behaviors had another meaning. Some analysts claim that Yeltsin deliberately displayed these behaviors, thus drawing an image of an unpredictable leader against the West. Because an unpredictable leader can have a stronger position at the negotiating table. If the other side can't know what you'll do, they may make more concessions to you. But how realistic this theory is debatable. Because Yeltsin's health problems were real. His alcohol addiction was real. And this seriously weakened his leadership. When he resigned in 1999, Russia was in the midst of a deep crisis. The economy had collapsed, oligarchs were running the country, and the people hated Yeltsin. But that night in Washington was etched into history differently. Because that night showed how fragile a superpower's leader could be, how vulnerable security systems were, and how diplomatic relations were built on such a delicate balance. And now comes the really interesting part. These events came out not during Bill Clinton's presidency, but after. A historian named Taylor Branch included these details when turning his private interviews with Clinton into a book. When the book was published, the media focused on this story. Headlines like, "Yeltsin went out into the street half-naked for pizza," echoed worldwide. But what was interesting was how these news stories were framed. Most media outlets presented the incident as an entertaining anecdote. Drunk leaders' stories always attract interest. But very few touched on the serious security and political issues underlying this incident. Very few questioned why it was hidden for so long. Very few analyzed how Yeltsin's psychological state affected world politics. Because what's really important here is how a leader's personal weaknesses shape international relations. Yeltsin's alcoholism wasn't just his problem. It became Russia's problem, America's problem, the world's problem. Because he controlled nuclear weapons. He commanded the army. He made diplomatic decisions. And he did all this while drunk. This was one of the most dangerous periods in history. The Cold War had ended, but tensions continued. Russia had weakened, but was still powerful. And its leader was out of control. So how similar was this situation to other leaders? When we look at history, we see many leaders with drinking problems. Winston Churchill's love of drink is known. But he could do his job. Yeltsin, however, was increasingly losing control, and this affected Russia's future. Because when Yeltsin resigned, Vladimir Putin replaced him. And Putin was a leader completely opposite to Yeltsin. Disciplined, calculated, cool-headed. He built order out of Yeltsin's chaos. But this order shifted toward authoritarianism. And the roots of the situation Russia is in today go back to those Yeltsin years. That night in Washington wasn't just a drunkenness story. It was a turning point. It was a symbol of Yeltsin's weakness. It was an indicator of America's power. And it was proof of how fragile the world order was. Now I want to tell you something else. When these events came out, Russia officially made no statement. The Yeltsin family remained silent. The Kremlin didn't address the matter. Because what could they say? Were they going to say, yes, our president got drunk and got lost in the streets of Washington? Of course not. That's why they chose a denial strategy. They ignored the matter. But this silence also became proof that the incident was real. Because if it had really been fiction, Russia would have used it. They would say American propaganda and create an international scandal. But they didn't do this. Because they knew it was true. And perhaps the most important question is this. Did this incident change world history? The answer is both yes and no. It didn't create a direct, major impact. Yeltsin continued his presidency. American-Russian relations continued on their way. But indirectly, it showed how evident Yeltsin's weakness was. And this accelerated the end of his power. Because Yeltsin's circle was beginning to understand that he could no longer lead. His health problems were getting progressively worse. His alcoholism had become uncontrollable. And in 1999, he unexpectedly resigned. He brought in Vladimir Putin in his place. And Russia's fate changed. But that night in Washington still remained like a secret. Because we don't know all the details. Secret Service agents' reports are classified. CIA files are closed. We'll never know what went through Yeltsin's mind that night. Maybe he really just wanted pizza. Maybe he felt lost. Maybe he was trying to escape from pressure. Or maybe he wasn't thinking anything. He was just drunk. But one thing is certain. That night, one of the strangest diplomatic incidents in history occurred. And this incident shows us that leaders are also human. They have weaknesses. They make mistakes. And sometimes these mistakes affect not just themselves, but the entire world. Yeltsin's legacy is complex. He's remembered as the man who brought down the Soviet Union. He's seen as a leader who tried to bring Russia to democracy. But he's also criticized as someone who dragged the country into chaos, surrendered to oligarchs, and laid the groundwork for Putin's rise. And that Washington night became a symbol of all this complexity. Because that night, Yeltsin was both powerful and weak. Both a superpower's leader and a man lost in the streets. Both someone who changed the course of history and a person who lost control. What remains of Yeltsin today are a controversial legacy, contradictory assessments, and of course that Washington story. When people think of Yeltsin, they now remember not only the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the half-naked leader searching for pizza at midnight. And perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is this: power, alcohol, and politics are a dangerous mix. No matter how powerful leaders are, they can't stop being human. And their human moments can sometimes shake all power structures. When Yeltsin died, he was met with mixed emotions in Russia. Some commemorated him as a hero of freedom. Others remembered him as someone who destroyed the country. But no one forgot him, because he was, for better or worse, one of the most important figures in Russia's modern history. And that night in Washington is now a part of history. It lives on in documents, books, memories. Maybe we'll never learn all the details. Maybe some secrets will remain hidden forever. But one thing is certain. What happened that night was one of the most extraordinary moments in diplomatic history. So what do you think? Was Yeltsin really just drunk, or was there something else underlying this incident? Why did American intelligence shut it down so quickly? And did this incident really affect world history? The answers aren't clear, but the questions are still there. Because this is also one of history's most interesting stories. A story where documents, testimonies, and secrets are intertwined. The story of a leader's collapse, a superpower's weakness, and how fragile the world order is. And today, years later, this story is still being talked about, still being debated, still being wondered about. Because people are always interested in secret stories. They always want to see the weak moments of the powerful. And they always wonder what's happening in the background of history. Yeltsin's Washington adventure is exactly such a story. Funny on the surface, serious in depth, seemingly simple, actually complex, and most importantly, real. Because sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. Sometimes the course of history can change in one night. And sometimes a leader's pizza craving can turn into an international crisis. Whatever this story teaches you, never forget one thing. Power is not absolute. Leaders are not flawless. And history's greatest events sometimes begin in the smallest moments. That night in Washington was just such a moment. Small, but unforgettable. Funny, but serious. And it will remain forever as part of Boris Yeltsin's legacy.